Hi everybody, it's Stephanie here. Welcome to my channel. Today I am making a cake that looks like the Loot Llama from Fortnite Battle Royale. What I absolutely love about this cake is that there's a hidden treasure on the inside of it. So when you cut it open, a bunch of candies and sprinkles spill out. Before we get started, will you please go down and hit the subscribe button for me? I'm trying to get up to 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I'm nowhere near that amount. All right, come on, let's get started. I begin moving my cake over to my board. I get that on there, and then I add a layer of buttercream frosting. The next two layers are different because that's where the hidden treasure will be. I'm using a rectangle template to cut out holes in these two cakes. Usually I work with cold cake, but this time I let it sit out for a little bit too long, so it was kind of hard to move. So try not to do that. You should always work with cold cake. I've got those two layers moved over, and now it's time to make my candy mixture for the hidden treasure. I'm combining M&Ms and a few different types of sprinkles. My daughter says you can never have too much candy, so that's what I'm going with. After I got the candy in, I decided to add one more layer to the hidden treasure part of the cake. So I repeated the process with more cake and more candy. I gave it another layer of buttercream frosting, and then I put back some of my extra cake to fill in that gap. I added more buttercream frosting and then one more layer of cake. This top layer does not need to have a rectangle cut out of it. I completely coat the outside of the cake with buttercream, and then I add more buttercream to round out the backside where the tail is. And then I pop the entire thing into the refrigerator to chill. Next, I'm covering the cake completely in buttercream, and then I let it chill until the buttercream is completely hard. It's time to carve. I'm starting with the neck, and I'm getting rid of that cake there. And then I carve off part of the head at an angle. I always refer back to my Loot Llama picture to make sure I'm carving it correctly. I've got the basic shape of my llama, but I wanted to build up some buttercream here on the side so it doesn't look too flat. I smooth that part out, and I completely cover the cake in buttercream frosting again. Moving on to his chin. The chin sticks way out in a weird goofy way, so I decided to make it out of modeling chocolate. I'm using my hands to shape the chin. I chose modeling chocolate for this because it holds its shape and it gets hard, and modeling chocolate will stick underneath the board, something that fondant will not do. I insert skewers into the chin just to help support it, and then I insert that into the cake. Here I'm adding more modeling chocolate to build up the sides of his chin. I'm using Hot Hands modeling chocolate for this, and I'm smoothing it out and shaping it with a tool called a sugar shaper. Before I can add any fondant, I first need to smooth out my buttercream. I like to dip my offset spatula into a glass of hot water. I dry it off with a paper towel, and I use it to smooth out any imperfections. Next, I'm cutting out where the eye will be. I first mark it with a circle cutter, and then I use a small spoon to scoop out just a little bit of the cake. Next up are the legs. I'm making the legs out of rice cereal treats. To get the treats to stick to the covered rod, you first have to brush it with melted marshmallows. I've sprayed my hands with some cooking spray, and I mold the treats onto the covered rod. Once the treats have hardened, I use my knife to cut away some of the treats to square them off and to make them more smooth. I typically cover my cereal treats with modeling chocolate, but I was running low this time, so I went with buttercream. It worked well. I like that way too. Alright, let's begin the decorating. Beginning with the legs, I'm cutting out strips of black fondant, and I'm placing it around the foot of the llama. I make thicker strips of blue fondant and cover the upper parts of the legs, and I cut away the excess with my Xacto knife. Next, I'm rolling out my purple fondant to about 1/4 inch thick. I'm draping it over my rolling pin, and then I unroll it onto the head of my llama. And then I use my hands to smooth out the folds in the fondant, and I cut the fondant where the mouth is, and use my sugar shaper to kind of push the fondant down and into the mouth. In some places I have to use my scissors because this is such an odd shape. I just do the best that I can to cut and smooth out the fondant. For extra sharp corners, press 2 fondant smoothers together at the edges. You can do the same with 2 pieces of plastic. The llama has a line on his face, so to make this, I use my ruler as a straight edge, and I draw a line on the face with my Dresden tool. The llama is also covered in little strips of paper like a pinata. So to make them, I'm cutting out strips of fondant with my ribbon cutter, and I'm using this 6-wheel pastry cutter to make small cuts on the strip. And then I move the strips over onto the cake. Some of the strips are ruffled, so I occasionally bent some of them upwards. And then I cover the entire cake this exact way in the different colors of the Loot Llama. The llama has a black strip right before his neck starts, so halfway up I added a black strip of fondant to match. After I've gotten all my paper strips on the cake, I'm moving on to the saddle. I'm using my ruler to measure the exact size for the top of the saddle, and I cut it out of fondant, which is pretty easy. For the sides, I printed out a picture of the saddle from the internet, and I'm using it as a template. I cut out the brown and white pieces and cut out the arrow freehand. I use a little water to attach all these pieces together, and then I move them over to the cake. You do need something like gum glue or piping gel to attach the heavy pieces like this. The saddle has a bunch of silver pieces. There are hinges, a lock, a handle on the top. All of these pieces were made out of fondant with a little bit of Tylos powder mixed into it. I colored the fondant a light gray, and then I brushed them with silver highlighter dust. I attached all of these pieces to the cake with piping gel. The lock was pretty heavy, so I used a toothpick to help secure it into the cake. Next up are the leather strips on the llama's head. I'm just cutting out some fondant strips here, and I attached them to my cake with edible glue. There's also a circle decoration right at the jaw area, so I'm cutting that out with a piping tip, and I'm pressing the back of it with a paintbrush to make an indentation. And then I get that piece onto the cake. The teeth are pretty goofy looking. To make them, I just cut out a strip of white fondant and I attach it inside the mouth. I am also putting the nostrils into place. These I've cut out of black fondant. I noticed that the llama has a darker shade of purple around its eye, so I decided to airbrush it just a tiny bit right under the eye. Alright, moving on to the whites of the eye. I rolled out a thick piece of fondant and I placed a piece of plastic wrap over it so that it will have a softer edge, and then I cut it out. I attached that to the cake with piping gel. Here I'm smoothing it out with my hands, and then I'm painting around the eye with a little bit of black food coloring gel mixed with a tiny drop of vodka. And next I'm adding a small black circle in the middle of the eye. The llama has some tall ears, so I'm making these out of modeling chocolate because I want them to hold their shape. I'm cutting these out freehand, and then I'm attaching them to the cake with piping gel and toothpicks. For the tail, I cut out strips of fondant with a little bit of Tylos powder mixed into it. I let them dry for a couple of hours, and then I attached them to the cake with candy melts. Just a couple more things to do. I'm decorating the board with coconut grass. To color it, I'm mixing in some green, brown, and yellow airbrush color into my coconut. I went a little overboard with the food color here, but it looks pretty good. To get my coconut to stick onto my board, I'm brushing it with some green candy melts, and then I sprinkle the coconut on top of it. I'm finishing it off with some ribbon. It's funny because I didn't even notice that the ear fell off at this point. So I had to go back and reattach it with candy melts. The Loot Llama cake is all finished. Let's cut into it. This is my favorite part. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you learned how to make your own Loot Llama cake. If you learned anything at all, will you please go down and hit the subscribe button or share this video with your friends. Also, if you're on social media, please be sure to check me out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.